This video is looking at standard number 3, which is for you to plan for and implement effective teaching and learning. So are you looking for evidence for your teaching and learning practices, and then monitoring the effect of what you're doing in terms of teaching and learning on your students' learning? The first descriptor asks you to set explicit, challenging, and achievable learning goals for all students. So teaching resources such as presentations, booklets, etc. should have learning goals or objectives on them or in them, and they need to be in plain language that the students actually understand. So if your outcomes in your syllabus don't actually make sense, then you probably should reword them for your students so that it's at the level that they can actually understand. These should be referred to and checked off as they're achieved. So I often in my classes will put the goals up on the board, or I might put it at various stages through a PowerPoint, for example. And then as I know that we're hitting those learning goals, I'll refer back and go, okay, we've done that one, tick it off, we're moving on to the next one, and really helping the students to see that they're achieving things as you're going through in your class. Goals should also be student specific, so you can have some general ones, but then you also need some ones that focus really specifically for your student to ensure that they are both challenging and achievable for them. So you need to know where they are, where they're trying to get to, and you need to know how they need to get there. What do they need to do in order to achieve that goal? And it's your job to really help them to break things down to achieve those goals, have smaller sub-goals to achieve those larger ones, much like what's in your reflection journal. There should also be goals in individual learning plans that should be both subject specific and general in nature to really help the student develop. It might be socially, or it might be in their way that they get organized or something like that. Make sure they actually have life goals as well as learning ones. Descriptor 3.2 says you need to plan and implement well-structured learning and teaching programs or lesson sequences that engage students and promote learning. So create and use your own programs or lesson sequences, and they should be relevant and engaging for the students that you have in your class, right? That goes all the way back to number 1, that knowing the students and how they learn. What are you doing to really link in with who your students are in front of you? This will always be context specific. So it's about your students' interests, the challenges that are appropriate to your students' levels, the connections that you can make to the real world and to their real world. And how do you promote learning? How do you enhance students' responsibility for their own learning? And goal setting is often really helpful for that. And so is peer learning. But what else are you going to do to really assist your students to take on a bit more responsibility, make sure that they are doing things to develop themselves further and not always relying on you? The third descriptor says you should select and use relevant teaching strategies to develop knowledge, skills, problem solving, and critical and creative thinking. Now this really should be quite clear in your programs. If you have a whole unit, for example, where you're looking at what it means to be an Australian in English or something like that, then you should have in there some strategies where you're just developing the students' knowledge. Something that looks at developing their skills might be literacy, some problem solving, and then what are they doing that's critical, and what are they doing that's creative, and it should exist in a whole unit. It doesn't necessarily have to be in every single lesson, but that really should have some kind of flow. And you'll actually notice this matches up quite well with Bloom's taxonomy for learning, where the students have knowledge, skills, and then they can start doing problem solving. Critical and creative thinking is towards the top end of Bloom's taxonomy. So you should have strategies clear in your units or programs or in your general lesson plans that you use to develop these in students. And that's the other thing. You need to make sure that you're developing this, not just them solving a problem, but how are you helping them to develop the skills around problem solving? How are you helping them to think critically? So, when we're looking at knowledge, we're talking about content, recall. Have you got spaced repetition in there to make sure that the students are really developing their knowledge? When we're looking at skills, is there explicit instructions, the copy me type stuff? Do you have repetition in there for them to practice those skills? It's not just do the skill or use it somehow, but it's actually how do you teach it? How do you help your student to grow that skill? Problem solving, so teaching processes or steps that you use to help students learn to problem solve. It's not just giving them the problem and asking them to solve it, like I said earlier. It is how do you support them in solving the problems. And it doesn't mean you solve the problem for them, but you're helping them to work out the steps or what steps they might take even, and let them have that dead end road where they go down for half a lesson and don't get anywhere because they've done the wrong thing. Helping them to actually reflect on that and think, okay, what am I going to do next time? What are you doing to help them to critically think? It's not just asking them to be critical, but teaching them how to be critical, guiding them as they attempt to be critical and evaluate some content. So helping them to make the connections that need to be made, and then seeing they go, okay, if this is true and someone says this, how do I put them together? Or do I need to use this as a criteria and say, okay, that does not work? And so, to begin with your lower ability students or your younger students, you might need to provide that kind of judgment criteria. And then as they get better at it, you can start to remove the criteria and let them come up with their own. And finally, creative thinking. Again, this is not just about telling them go and be creative. It's about helping them to be creative in terms of the content, communicating, solving problems, their innovations, ideas, etc. How do you help them to be creative? Now, this takes a lot of time. It requires them to connect ideas and stuff, but it really is invaluable for our students and their learning. So where have you got that explicitly in your units, in your lesson plans, etc.? The fourth descriptor for this standard asks you to select and/or create and use a range of resources, including ICT, to engage students in their learning. Now, you should have a wide range of resources that you use throughout any unit. So that might be presentations, videos, some booklets, maybe a couple of texts, websites. You might have the kids do some research. You might have some medical articles, group discussion scaffolds, some kind of stimulus for your students to use, report scaffolds, images, whatever it happens to be. You should have a large range of resources that you use inside your programs and in your units. Now, the descriptor is not ICT resources only, okay, but it says you should include ICT within this. So you should have resources that are not ICT and ones that are using ICT, and make sure you have a balance, because ICT is not the answer. Okay, ICT is only good if it actually helps you achieve your goal, your learning and teaching goal, right? And then do these resources help to engage students? That's the next question. So you might have these resources, but are they actually engaging students, or are the students just kind of looking at that image and go, I have no idea what that is because it's 3,000 years old? You want to make sure that you have things that are engaging them to help them to actually make sense of what's going on. How do you know that your students are engaged? How do you know that they're achieving stuff? Do you survey them? Is it done on observations that maybe other teachers coming in and watching you? Or is it a presumption that you have where the classroom's quiet and therefore they're engaged? Because that's not always the case. And then you should also evaluate these resources. So it's not in this descriptor, but it's something that you should be doing anyway. Any resource you have, you should evaluate it and go, okay, is this actually working? Is it engaging the students? If not, chuck it, change it, whatever needs to happen, so that you have resources that are helping engage your students in the learning. The fifth descriptor for this standard asks you to use effective verbal and non-verbal communication strategies to support student understanding, participation, engagement, and achievement. Okay, so verbal strategies include using student names. It includes changing the volume and the tone of your voice according to what's appropriate in the learning context. It's about accepting student responses, even if they're wrong, because it's about showing respect as you're doing that and making sure that your students are getting a chance to provide some kind of response. Non-verbal strategies include where you position yourself in the room. Do you just stand at the front and talk, or do you walk around the class as you talk? Do you walk around while the kids are doing work, or do you sit at your desk? It might even be some visual cues that you use. What are some demonstrations? Maybe on PE, so we demonstrate a lot of stuff. Are you using hand signals to get your students to be quiet so they know that they need to pay attention to you? Are there visuals on a board? Are there visuals on a projector that are really helping to communicate what it is that you're talking about and trying to help pass on to your students? You need to ensure that these enhance student understanding of the content, that they enhance their participation and their engagement and their achievement. It's not just about keeping them quiet, it's about actually helping them learn. The focus is always on the learning, not on what's going on in terms of their noise levels or anything like that. It's about how you're helping them learn in your classroom. And so your strategies should help them to understand. So you might have a diagram that you're explaining that goes along with your verbal. It might help them to participate, because you might ask select people to make sure that they're participating and engaging in what's going on. It might be you walking around the room to make sure students are on task and engaged. The sixth descriptor asks you to evaluate personal teaching and learning programs using evidence, including feedback from students and student assessment data to inform planning. So it is really important when you're looking at your units, your programs, your lesson sequences, that you have some kind of data that you're using to guide your reflection, because you have in your brain this preconceived perception of what you're doing and what's going on in your classroom. And in reality, research tells us that we actually don't see over 50% of what's going on in our classroom because we are one person in that class. So when you actually go about reflecting on and evaluating your programs or your units of work, do you have something that you're drawing on? Have you surveyed your students to see what they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy? Maybe thinking about, ask them, did this address your learning needs? Ask them which particular activities they found that helped them to learn the most. And then also matching that up with their assessment results, because if you're looking at their assessment results and they're saying, oh, this really helped me a lot and I knew that really well, but then their assessment actually says the opposite. These students aren't always the best people to provide feedback, but they do provide a really good source of feedback. But you should also use lots of formative assessments. In fact, formative assessment is something you should be doing every lesson to really help you to understand where your students are, how they're progressing in terms of where you're trying to get them to, or maybe where they're trying to get to. And it's really important because it allows you to know what's working, what's not working. I often will ask my students to do a reflection on their learning, and I'll always ask them questions like, what did I do today that helped you with your learning? What did I do today that got in the way and stopped you from being able to learn? Did something come up that was difficult for you? What did you do about that? What could you do differently next time, to really help them to develop their thinking, but it also provides a lot of insight for me about what's going on in their brains, what they think they've actually understood well, what they don't understand well, and actually doing that frequent assessing of them to see how they're progressing, what they're actually developing in terms of their knowledge, and then using that to adjust your program even as you go. If you know that the kids didn't understand something and you're about to do a bit of content that develops that further, you need to make sure you go back to make sure that they understand that content before you build on it, because you can't build on something that the kids don't have yet. Even if the syllabus says you've got to get through the content, it's much better for your students to actually learn the bits that you cover than for you to cover everything and then not actually learn any of it. So all this data from your assessments, whether that be your formal or informal, your formative assessments, the surveys you do of your students, whatever it is, they should be used to identify the strengths and weaknesses of your programs and of your units, of your lessons, and for you to make changes for next year or for the next lesson, whatever it happens to be. You need to be making sure you're using it to make adjustments. The final descriptor for this standard asks you to plan for appropriate and contextually relevant opportunities for parents and carers to be involved in their children's learning. Now, this, depending on your context, can be really easy or be really difficult. And so it's important for you to think through your units, think through the content that you're covering and the activities you're going to get your students to do, and find clear places where parents can be involved. Now, if you're doing this well already, you should see those straight away as you're looking through your programs. You should go, okay, this is a clear one where I've sent the students home to interview their parents. We bring that into school and we discuss it a bit further. Or maybe you flip your classroom and it's a requirement that your parents also watch some of those videos with your students so they can help the student to really engage further. Or maybe you have a particular parent come in who has a particular skill. Maybe they're an ambulance officer and you're doing first aid with your students, and they're going to come in and do a bit of a talk about life and their role, their job, and how a first aid person will help them to save someone's life. Anything like that. They're just some basic ideas that you should be looking at in your programs.